So welcome to this session on key opportunities for reducing methane emissions, even during challenging times. I'm Rob Stavins, know many of you, great to see you again. Professor of Environmental Economics at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm going to be moderating this session. We have a truly superb set of expert panelists. In order down the row, Daniel Jacob, Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Environmental Engineering at Harvard. John Goldstein, the Associate Vice President for Energy Transition at the Environmental Defense Fund. Carrie Jenks, Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. And then finally, last but not least, Vanessa Ryan, the General Manager for Climate and Engagement at the Chevron Corporation. Now, we have only about 40 minutes remaining, and given the number of panelists, and also all of you, because you're probably going to want to have questions or comments yourselves, we're going to be very strict with time limits. And each panelist is going to start, including myself, with a 5-minute only commentary. And then after that, we're going to turn to your questions. What I'm going to do is really to provide an overview of a Harvard-wide initiative in this realm and also establish a common denominator among us regarding why we're here to talk about methane, which may be remedial for most of you. So why focus on reducing global methane emissions? Obviously, it's received a lot less attention historically, whether in the international negotiations or in many countries until recently, than carbon dioxide as a driver of climate change. And after all, absolute quantities of CO2 are greater than absolute quantities of methane emissions that are being released anthropogenically. And the half-life of CO2 in the atmosphere, of course, exceeds 100 years, but methane's atmospheric lifetime is more in the order of a decade or so. On the other hand, methane has an extremely high global warming potential per unit, per molecule, compared with CO2 over a 100-year time horizon. If that's your accounting, then in terms of CO2 equivalent, it would be 28 times as effective in radiative forcing per unit. And if we were counting over 20 years, then it's 84 times as effective in radiative forcing. Now, that leads to some ambiguity. What's the right time period for making the comparison? So another thing we can do is just ask historically, since industrialization in the world, going backwards to the present, what share of radiative forcing global warming has been due to methane? And the answer is about 30% since the Industrial Revolution. So it's extremely important, and methane emissions abatement can therefore significantly reduce greenhouse gas concentrations and climate change, particularly in the short term. And that can be important because it can give the world time to bend the curve on CO2 emissions, conduct research on carbon mitigation and carbon removal, things, of course, we're hearing about in all the other sessions at this conference, and implement longer-term strategies to mitigate and, for that matter, to adapt to climate change. So because of this, in 2023, we launched a Harvard-wide initiative on reducing global methane emissions. I have the privilege of directing that. It's one of the research clusters, one of 5 research clusters of the Salata Institute on Climate and Sustainability. And the initiative, importantly, combines research with effective engagement with key stakeholders. We actually have 22 research outreach projects involving several dozen faculty, fellows, and PhD students coming from 7 departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, 5 professional schools at Harvard, and disciplines which range from physics to history. And by collaborating in what are typically, as we may hear today, multidisciplinary teams, we've already seen the whole become greater than the sum of the parts, which was our objective. In fact, 2 of our panelists today are very engaged in this initiative with each other and with others. That's Daniel Jacob and Carrie, Jenks. And so with that, I'm now going to turn to our panelists, our experts, starting with Daniel Jacob, and I'm going to ask pose to each of them a question, which we hope you will answer. And for Daniel, can you comment on how satellite data, with which you've worked with as much as anyone in the world, can enable action now?
Thank you for this softball, Rob. So Rob asked me no slides, which makes me feel a little weird, but it's part of his strategy to hold me to 5 minutes. All right, so a big challenge in figuring out how to control methane emissions is to figure out where, when, and how methane gets emitted. Because methane is emitted by a range of sources, generally having to do with biology or with leaks or with operational practices. And those are extremely difficult to quantify and therefore make it complicated to devise a strategy to reduce methane emission by focusing on the big sources. This is where atmospheric observations can play an important role by telling us where, when, and how much methane is getting emitted. And satellites play a critical role in this because they provide global continuous observations. Methane has nowhere to hide. I've been involved now for over 10 years in exploiting satellite observations of methane, generating those observations, and more recently in the Harvard Methane Initiative and in partnership with Carrie. We've been using a satellite that's been in orbit since 2018 called CHOPOMI that provides you with global daily monitoring of methane. And then we've also been using a bunch of satellite instruments that provide information on specific point sources. Now, those satellites observe methane concentrations, but when you combine this with an atmospheric transport model, you obtain methane emissions. And there's a lot of math behind this that, of course, I don't want to go through, particularly without any slides. All right. Now, we've already made, I think, very important discoveries thanks to the satellite data. We now have well established that livestock and landfills are the most important methane sources. We have found that the reason why methane concentrations are increasing right now is largely due to increases in livestock and landfills, that more of an offset, a decrease in oil and gas emissions. We figured out that landfill emissions in the United States, and this is a project that did with Carrie, are extremely variable from landfill to landfill in ways that don't really relate to how much waste you have in place or any kind of easy, predictable variables, but instead have to do with differences in operations from landfills to landfill, which also means that there's a lot of opportunity for reducing methane emissions. We found, again, from satellite observations, that the methane intensity of oil and gas operations in the US has been going down. Methane intensity being how much you emit per unit of gas that you produce. And this indicates improving operations. We've also found that some Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, are clean as a whistle in their oil and gas industry. We don't see anything coming out from them, and there are reasons for this. And then also with point source observations, we've been able to figure out that a lot of those large emissions that you see often reported have to do with venting practices. They don't really have to do with leaks. They don't have so much to do with inefficient flares. Those happen, of course, but it's mostly sloppy practices during maintenance of a piece of equipment. A lot of methane gets emitted, which also gives an opportunity for climate action. Now, looking towards the future, we have increasing resources available from satellites. Unfortunately, we lost MethaneSat, as you know, that was going to give us oil and gas monitoring. But we've had several satellites launched just this year that will give us improved information on methane. There's a GOSAT GW satellite instrument that was launched by the Japanese that focuses on urban emissions of methane. There's a Sentinel-4 launched by the Europeans that is going to provide us improved global mapping of methane. There's Carbon Mapper that launched its first satellite as part of a constellation to observe methane point sources and report the results directly to the public. So the future looks bright in terms of being able to use satellite observations to enable climate action. And with this, I'll stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. 40 seconds left. Very good. So we're going to turn next to John Goldstein from the Environmental Defense Fund. I mean, it's well known, I assume, or at least the hypothesis, that anyone who doesn't follow the news is that the federal government is cutting back, pulling back on its activities. During Trump 1.0, that meant that the activities of states were relatively more important on environment because of the pullback. What about in Trump 2.0? Is there real potential for progress from U.S. states and, for that matter, from other countries?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. I do think there's reason for optimism because of state and international efforts. But first, I wanted to key off of something Daniel was saying around, more and more data. And this creates, in my mind, a real conundrum. That is, there's more data than ever before. We have a better understanding than we ever have before about the sources of methane emissions. And yet, at the same time, right now, we have a federal government that's trying to pull back from that collection of data and from the dissemination of that data. So we've seen a proposal to do away with the greenhouse gas reporting program. We've seen proposals to mothball climate monitoring satellites. And I think this creates a real tension in terms of, how, to take Secretary Wright at his word. He was in Europe last week talking about how the United States has the cleanest natural gas in the world. I think it's difficult for me to understand how we're going to be able to show our work if we don't have this data. And so that was the first point I wanted to bring forward. And I think that one of the reasons, and this goes back to the optimism, that there will continue to be efforts to reduce methane emissions is because the United States is not an island. We are the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, but we're also the largest exporter of that oil and gas in the world. And the markets that we export to, many of them are starting to move in the direction of requiring that energy to be as clean as it can be. And they're putting real math and real teeth behind those efforts. So the European Union has been moving on import standards, and several Asian markets are also moving to implement similar sets of requirements. This is going to mean, and Vanessa can speak to this better than me, this is going to mean additional impetus, I think, for producers to be able to show what they're doing and be able to show how clean they are. And I think that's incredibly important and a source of optimism for me. Meanwhile, states are not holding back either. In fact, just yesterday, the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission voted to move forward on implementing the existing source standards that were finalized last spring under the Biden administration to require things like frequent leak inspections, swapping out, devices that are known to pollute for newer ones that don't, and things like that. And they're going to be moving forward on that in February. And that's not just, EDF and the Colorado state regulators agreeing. It was also the two major industry trade groups in the state. So Colorado API and the Colorado Oil and Gas Association also supported that effort. And I think that that's really, really, really critical to point out that, this time that we're in is very divisive. I don't need to tell you guys that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But when there are efforts at the state level that have regulators, industry, and the environmental community all agreeing on the importance of moving forward on something, especially right now, I think that's incredibly powerful and gives me a lot of reason for hope. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that. I mean, as everyone probably knows, there are three, you could generalize that the three major sources of methane emissions are oil and gas sector, agriculture, and landfills, agriculture being both livestock and paddy rice. On this panel, we have more attention really to the oil and gas sector, and something which John just pointed out will emphasize, and that is the ONG sector has actually been very active in working on methane emissions reductions, not just in Colorado, but globally. We'll probably hear more about that, but it's an interesting case. We can't say that's true always across the board for CO2, but for methane, it certainly is the case. So with that, I want to turn to Carrie. You know, Carrie, it seems that EPA is indeed eliminating its climate programs, but can EPA, despite that, make any progress in this methane realm?
Yeah. So at our program at the law school, we think about how do you design regulations.
Could you use one of the mics, I think, because
I got.
Oh, you've got
Can
one
you guys
on.
hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
It's just that I think they're also recording it.
Oh, she has one of the shirt mics on.
Oh, you've got a shirt
Yeah,
mic on. I'm sorry,
that's
I didn't
okay.
know.
Okay.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So we think about how you design a regulation to be durable. And by that, I mean companies know how to comply with it. Agencies know if companies are complying with it, and then it achieves the environmental outcome, whatever that is intended. And then courts uphold it. So for all the reasons that we've talked about and that you know, that balance is really tricky right now. We have the federal government removing and eliminating a lot of regulations, and we also have courts really skeptical of agencies, especially the past administration's environmental regulations. But methane, I think, is really interesting to work on because there is a market driver for companies to reduce their emissions, and there's an economic driver. And so if you can balance that out, especially as technologies are advancing, like Daniel was talking about, it creates an opportunity that I think it should shift the conversation for EPA. Whether it does or not, we can talk about, but it should be different. I think another reason that it's interesting is that the technologies are advancing so fast that the regulatory pace, even if you wanted to regulate, can't necessarily keep up with the technology advancements. And as Daniel was talking about, in order for the technologies to work, you need to be looking at the right time, in the right spot, and using different technologies for different types of systems. So we need more information about what works where and the market pull for these technologies to continue to advance. But as John was mentioning, we've seen EPA eliminate the endangerment finding or propose to eliminate the endangerment finding, which is the fundamental foundation for EPA regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And they just proposed, I think it was last week, to remove the greenhouse gas reporting rule for oil and gas, as well as many other sectors as well. And without data, it's really hard to regulate. If you don't have information that's transparent and companies don't know what works where, then it's hard to know what is actually happening on the ground. But I think at the moment, EPA is trying to continue to revise one of the rules that the Biden administration finalized, which many people refer to as the Quad O rules, which is the rule that EPA uses to say, design your systems to be less leak prone and go out and look for leaks. And if you find them, fix them. And so for the market reasons, you could imagine if you leak less, you have more product to sell. So I could articulate a way that you could say, if you are trying to sell gas to others across the countries, you want to make sure it is marketable and you can sell more product if you leak less of that methane. So it can fit into the energy dominance agenda. There's a lot of ways they could decide not to do this, and I think we could talk through those legal arguments. But if they decide to move forward, I think there's an opportunity to get more information about how these technologies work. And I think there's an incentive if companies know what's working, and Vanessa can correct me if I'm wrong, if they know what's working to reduce the methane emissions, then I think we get more transparent information, and those opportunities can continue to drive progress. And so I think it will be interesting to see, does EPA revise these regulations, or do they decide, more consistent with what we've seen to date, just to eliminate them completely? If they do completely eliminate them, I think we look at states. They think they will still, though, regulate VOC emissions from new sources, and because that's not a greenhouse gas, and so it's a different part of the Clean Air Act. And if they do that, then we're not looking at existing sources, so I think it's a significant loss, but you'll still see companies deploying these technologies for new sources, and that's another market pull that I think is important to mention. So just 3 things that I'm watching for, because I think there's a lot of uncertainty, is how do companies respond to EPA on the endangerment finding comments, which are due on Monday? Do companies start to articulate the economic reasons that they don't want a patchwork of state rules, but they would rather have a consistent national program? How do they respond to EPA on the greenhouse gas reporting rule and the elimination of the data? Companies, I think, largely wanted EPA to continue this process because it gives them a platform to show what's happening on the ground. Those comments are due in November. And then I think by the end of this year, we're expecting EPA to propose what they're going to do on these leak detection rules. So do they propose to eliminate it or complete or revise it some, and how do companies engage? One theme we're hearing in a lot of different panels today is that there's an economic driver for action. And so do companies start to articulate that economic driver, and does the administration listen?
So in terms of an economic driver for action, one of the realities, of course, as we turn to Vanessa, one of the realities is that if an O&G company, whether it's a small mom-and-pop operation or a multinational corporation, reduces venting, reduces flaring, or fixes leaks at the wellhead, pipeline, or at a pump, then it is potentially keeping more of a merchantable product called natural gas in the pipeline. And so it can be, it is not necessarily, it can be in some cases in the interest of the companies to reduce those emissions. There's a big cost in addition to the technologies, which are the search costs sometimes of finding where the emissions are. That's where what Daniel was talking about so much comes into play. Now, despite this, it would seem that it would be understandable if the O&G companies, of course I'm thinking particularly of Chevron, we're in a wait-and-see mode because a lot's happened in the last 6 months, God knows, from Washington. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 3 years? And then we don't know the administration after that. Industry finds uncertainty abhorrent, and there's now a lot of uncertainty. So is Chevron or your colleagues in other companies, are you in a wait-and-see mode, or is there actually real action and real progress now, Vanessa?
Great. Well, thank you for that. I also have the lapel.
Okay.
And before I answer that, I just wanted to say thank you for having me. And these are all folks who I regularly read and appreciate their perspectives. So it's a little bit of a little awestruck to be able to be sitting up here at the table with them. So, obviously I cannot speak for the entire global oil and gas industry, but I can talk a little bit about what Chevron's doing and what we're hearing from some of the partnerships we're involved in. So for those of you who don't know, Chevron is called an integrated operating company. We have upstream, so we produce oil and gas through refining and marketing. Our industry has a whole host of different operations, just over 2,000 in the Permian Basin alone, that most of them pick one part of the value chain. So we're somewhat unique. There's a smaller group of companies that cover the whole value chain. And at Chevron, we have a little bit of a motto in the methane space that's called, we just tell everybody it's all about keeping methane in the pipe. And it really getting back to what Carrie said, methane in the pipe is a product that we can sell. And our job is to produce the energy that a growing world needs. So the energy in the pipe is energy that meets our corporate purpose of providing energy. In that realm, we look at methane as a three-pronged strategy. The first prong is really looking at our designs, our facility designs. The second prong is around looking at how we operate our facilities. And the third prong is, very in line with what Daniel was talking about, is using advanced detection technologies to see where we may be not meeting the standard that we've set for ourselves in design or operation. And it's sort of an iterative process. We use the data we collect from the advanced detection technologies to inform further improvements in design and operations. Satellites are one piece of that ecosystem for us, one that's really exciting and interesting, and Daniel mentioned a whole host of satellite launches. There's also the realm of private satellites, which is what we utilize. We utilize a company called GHGSat that has 13 private satellites, so you can tell them where you want them to look and how frequently you want them to look. But there's also an ecosystem of public satellites. And all of that data is very valuable. If somebody knows about methane emissions on our sites, we want that information so we can then action it. We also use aircraft. Aircraft used to be a US-only option because the technology was primarily developed here and only deployed here. And I am very excited that yesterday an aircraft was flying in Kazakhstan over our operations for the first time. And we've also done campaigns in Australia and Argentina. And I think that's something that as Chevron we're really proud of. We're the first company that has taken this aircraft company outside the US, so we can really start to use some of the tools that help us do a good job here in our global operations. What we're hearing more from industry is very similar to what I'm seeing at Chevron. I was actually on a call with a small independent yesterday about the greenhouse gas reporting program. And similar to Chevron, they plan to keep collecting the data, regardless of what happens with the rules, because it's something that our investors expect to see now, but also something that we utilize to continue to improve our performance. So, whether that rule stays or goes, there's not going to be a real difference in how we collect and utilize that data internally. I have the benefit of chairing 2 industry programs that are very active in this space. One is called the Environmental Partnership. That's all U.S. operators. And another one is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative's Role of Gas. And that is the 12 largest operators. So that has national oil companies and domestic. And I have seen 0 drop in engagement, in funding, in the number of people from companies that are showing up at meetings and actively engaging and trying to continue to improve our industry's performance in this space. Some of that may be tied to the increasing public data available, but I also think that it's part of our culture now, and that I give a lot of credit to Environmental Defense Fund for. My first exposure to methane in Chevron was in 2012. We did a study that Environmental Defense Fund organized with the University of Texas, and they came on our sites, and 9 or 10 other operators measured emissions and said, gosh, some of our source categories in EPA's reporting are a little off. And that was a big learning. It helped us make sure that we were putting our money into the right places for mitigation. When you look back at the technologies we used in that study, it seems so quaint right now. We took a FLIR camera out, and when we saw emissions, we used something called a high flow meter to measure them. And now we know that those cameras actually miss a lot of emissions because they're looking for things that are known as opposed to looking at the whole site. And so now we have this whole new suite of technologies where we can see a whole site and see what we were missing before when we were just focused with cameras. And I think that's something that, similar to the Harvard effort, is due to a wide range of types of disciplines looking at this problem in a way towards solutions instead of just hand-wringing. So there's a lot of optimism within industry in deploying technology to help mitigate this challenge.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. One of the reasons why it's not always in the interest of an oil and gas company to reduce those emissions, to keep the merchantable product in the pipeline, is there may not be a pipeline available. It may not exist if it was from an oil source as opposed to a gas source, or the pipeline may not have adequate capacity. And that prompts me to take note of another person in the room who was part of our Harvard-wide initiative, PhD student Coley Elhai from the Department of Economics, who has done important research, which I think is now available on our website, looking at the effects of capacity constraints. This is in the case of Texas. So with that, we now want to take your questions. We have 12 minutes. We have to stop promptly at 5 minutes before the hour. So we can take your questions now. You can direct them to a specific panelist, or you can just offer a question in general. So we can get to as many as possible of you. I would ask that the questions be very brief and the responses be very brief. And when you ask your question, please just tell us your name and the institution that you work with. So with that, if you put up a hand, then I think the microphone will be brought to you.
Hi, My name is Frank Pato. I'm with a group called GCP Capital Partners. We're a private equity investment firm. I've been coming to this conference now for 3 years, and I'm very interested in methane emissions because historically we had invested in natural gas production companies, not something we invest in currently, but I haven't heard anybody talk about methane emissions from coal production and consumption. And when I read large reports from institutions like the IEA, the International Energy Agency, I have a hard time because I'm not a scientific expert. I'm just an investor. But it looks like the methane emissions associated with coal production and consumption are actually larger than the methane emissions associated with oil and gas production and consumption. So I'm just wondering, is anybody studying methane emissions from coal? I mean, I know that there's coal seam methane. That's the stuff that explodes in coal mines. How come that isn't getting focus, or at least I don't hear it talked about from academic focus? Why is that not a priority area? If it's actually larger than what comes out from natural gas, why isn't that getting focus or attention?
So I'll just mention before I turn to the panelists that one of the new projects of the 25 is looking at emissions from coal bed methane in China. So that's a new project that's just starting. Daniel, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So really quickly, current estimates of global emissions, about 60 teragrams per year for oil and gas and 30 to 40 for coal. So coal is about half of the emissions from oil and gas. The reason we don't spend so much time talking about coal is because the venting of methane from coal mines is an essential component of mine safety. You might say, well, you could flare that gas, except it tends to be too dilute to be flared. You could use that gas, but again, it tends to be dilute. Also, at least in the United States, the coal sources are going down, and that's because coal production is going down. So we tend not to focus on it that much, but it is important, as you point out.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Thank you. My name is Marlon Banta. I'm a faculty member in the School of Environmental Management at the Department of Continuing Ed. I teach 2 courses on greenhouse gas accounting. You talked about mitigation strategies in industry related to like facility design, operations, and advanced detection. Speaking of enteric fermentation, you know, the production of methane from cattle, are there strategies that are prominent to deal with that? You know, what is sort of the state of the art in the industry related to methane emissions from livestock?
Before, I'm not sure if anyone will want to comment on that. I'll just offer a brief comment, and that is 2, or maybe it's 3 now, of the 25 projects of the initiative who are not represented on this panel, however, are looking at ways of reducing methane emissions, both livestock sector and also rice paddies in the case of China. On the livestock one, it's a group at the Harvard School of Engineering, which is not very far from us, in which they are developing a device for monitoring emissions that's vastly better, using artificial intelligence, that's vastly better than what we've had before. Does anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, so there's a group of 5 or 6 oil and gas companies that Colorado State brought in to work with ag. They have institutes that cover both. So we've had maybe 10 or 11 opportunities to collaborate. They have some real challenges in that space. That we don't have to deal with in the oil and gas space. When they try to use a drone to measure cows, the cows don't produce milk for 2 or 3 days because they're so freaked out by the drone. So just a tidbit to understand the challenges. But there is a lot of really good work going on in the space, and these head box things that they measure with, and they can make adjustments to cattle lifestyle and feed and see what the impact is on their respiratory systems. But it is a really different challenge than oil and gas. I do think there's some things that we can share in terms of what we've learned on our monitoring journey, and that's what the Colorado State collaboration is all about. But it is a very unique challenge that industry faces.
You know, I should acknowledge, thank you for that, I should acknowledge that although in the Harvard Initiative we have work going on in agriculture, it's at schools like Colorado State, Texas A&M, University of California, Davis, that's at Cornell, where I just came back from, also doing a lot of work, in their case on dairy, Colorado State, probably also on feedlots. So other questions?
Thank you. My name is Grace Tian, HKR student, MPP. And my question is...
It's hard to hear you. I'm not sure that's turned on.
Oh, sorry. Hi. My name is Grace Tian from Kennedy School, MPP student. So I have a question about the opportunities for next 3 years of carbon methane reducing. So as a policymaker, do you think which pathway will be more efficient? The first one is federal plus local regulations and combined with the market mechanism, or we can count on the industry itself, like the subsidy, and the industry have the new rules for the methane emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn to Carrie, and maybe John would also like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's been a question, I would say, before we are in this administration on what the role of federal regulation is. Do you need federal regulation if you've got these market drivers? Should the government get out of the way? I think I disagreed with that premise in the prior administration. I think it's even clearer now that you do need federal regulations to make sure that everyone meets a minimum standard. I think you allow states to go further than that. Industry can drive further than that. But when you think about what the federal regulation is usually based on, it's usually based on what is working in the market, where are sort of the best practices. It's based on what are states doing, what state policies are there, and then what are the technologies happening that can be built upon. So I guess to answer your question, you need all of that. You need states to keep testing things, and then you need the federal government to be based on what is working, what's cost effective, because that's a key part of the Clean Air Act, is how do you justify that cost, and making sure the emission reductions happen. So I think it's all of the above.
So John and or Vanessa, did you want to offer anything?
Just a strong agree to what Carrie said. Yeah, you asked us to be brief, and my response was going to be yes. Yeah. We need them all, and the point, the case in point in my mind is the Permian Basin. So you look at the most productive oil and gas basin in the country, and by some measures in the world, it straddles 2 states, New Mexico and Texas, and you can see one of those states has acted at the state level to put requirements in place. And you see, as a result of that, a cleaner production profile and less methane intensity. Across the border in Texas, less so. And unless Texas will act, and we can talk about the politics behind why that might not happen, you really need the feds to step in.
Did you want to add anything? No. Okay. Another question. I'm allowing the microphone person to make the choice of who gets to ask the questions.
Hello. Carrie, you referred to the
I'm sorry, could you just identify yourself?
Yeah, Terry Mendelson from Columbia University. You referred to the prospect of a patchwork of state rules, and I'm wondering if you're aware of any efforts underway in anticipation of that happening, given what's happening at the federal level. Are states collaborating? What are they doing to address this need?
Yeah, I do think states collaborate, and at different levels. So Colorado is a great example. New Mexico is looking at what Colorado is doing. They all have to look at what their own state authorities are. And some states are coming at it from the methane perspective. Others are coming at it from sort of the traditional criteria air pollutants. But there's opportunities for states to start to learn best practices, understand the politics of it. How does Colorado pull the NGOs and the industry together? What was that hook that did that? And other states are clearly watching Colorado, California, Pennsylvania. But there's some states that will not do that on its own. And so I think states can make some progress, but there's going to be gaps to what John was saying.
Can I ask a follow-up question? If the Trump administration's attempt to eliminate the waiver that California enjoys, is that going to affect methane policies? It's certainly going to affect other policies, climate policies and environment, but is it going to affect methane in California?
It won't affect methane. I think it's going to affect the CAR standards. I think that what we are seeing from the Trump administration, though, is a threat when every time if it's data, if it's state action, if it's market drivers, the Trump administration seems to be trying to undercut that. And so there's a threat from some of the executive orders to go after state climate programs. Methane's not one that's articulated and listed at the moment, but California's climate programs are. So I think it's something to be watching. But I think states have the authority to do this on their own.
Very much so. And one really quick addition, folks may hear this and think, oh, it's just the blue states that are going to keep acting. The red states are going to sit back. And I wanted to point out, this methane, like Rob said, is natural gas. And so there's a real push here in states that want to increase their energy production to try and get after this methane and not waste so much of it. There's also the associated pollution that comes up with the methane, the volatile organic compounds that lead to ozone formation. And in red states, we've seen action to reduce those VOC emissions. Places like the Upper Green River Basin in Wyoming, where it's incredibly rural, and the air quality there at its worst was worse than Los Angeles. And it wasn't, like in LA, it wasn't people driving their cars. It was problems from the oil and gas development. And because of state-level leadership there from the Republican governor, that's gotten much better. And I think that those sorts of efforts will continue.
This will probably
I'm
be our
going to take
last
this.
question.
I apologize that because they're going to remove my tenure if I go past 5 minutes to the hour. So I am going to bring things to a close now. Anyone who wants to come up with a question afterwards, of course, you can do it. In bringing the session to a close, I want to note that we have, many members of the panel have supplied materials to the Slaughter Institute organizers, and somehow they are available to you through the conference website. In addition to that, if you go to the website of the Harvard Initiative on Reducing Global Methane Emissions, you will find many pages, lots of publications, descriptions of all of our research. The reality is that the urgency to deal with methane is significant, and it's never been particularly greater than now, given the lack of action in Washington and the possible implications of that for international progress. So the need for rigorous research has never been greater. People are always concerned about what's happening at Harvard with the federal government, but this university is going to continue to show global leadership. As I heard someone say, one of the provosts say, Harvard existed 200 years before the United States of America existed, and will be here. So with that, please join me in thanking our marvelous set of panelists, and thanks to all of you for participating.